In the name of Christ, who heals us. Amen.
Amen.
Give her something to eat, yeah. This is a twofer Sunday. We get two of the greatest healing stories for the price of one. And one of them is wrapped up inside the other. So it's kind of like a sandwich. We have the 12-year-old Jairus' daughter as the bread, and in the middle of the sandwich is the story of the woman with the hemorrhages. And they have a great deal in common, these two stories. There are certain similarities. There is Jesus' apparent compassion and concern for both the woman with the hemorrhage and the 12-year-old girl. Notice that the woman with the hemorrhage has had this illness for 12 years. And the girl is 12. So there's those interesting kinds of parallels about the story. But then there are some really significant differences. In relationship, first, Jairus is the head of the synagogue, the father of this girl. And so he's a person of substance, and he is the person, perhaps in town, that Jesus would most want to impress, if he were the kind of guy that wanted to impress people. The head of the synagogue is a guy you want to be on the in with, so he's somebody who has a lot of influence. On the other hand, this woman, sick for 12 years with a bleeding disease, that would render her unclean and socially unacceptable. She has no protector, unlike Jairus' daughter, who has Jairus. She has no man to step forward for her and speak to the teacher as would be appropriate. As a woman, she really didn't have the right to do that at all, let alone as an unclean woman. To touch him would be inappropriate for many reasons. And so the status is very, very different between Jairus and his daughter and this hemorrhaging woman. And Jesus' treatment of them is significantly different. In the case of Jairus' daughter, there's a great deal of secrecy. On his way to the house, he basically dismisses the crowd, takes just his very closest disciples with him. When he shows up at the house and all the mourners are there, he tells them to go away. And he also, you notice, tells them, oh, don't worry about it, she's only sleeping. I mean, what a ridiculous thing to say, unless what he was trying to do was minimize the situation so that people didn't make a big deal about it. Oh, they made a mistake. She was really just in a deep sleep, and he woke her up. That's not as astonishing as he raised her from the dead. And when he does raise her from the dead, that good old Markan messianic secret, it's back there one more time. Jesus says to her, to the family, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody what you just saw. So there's all this secrecy about this, which is kind of typical of Jesus. In Mark, Jesus is always concerned about preventing people from a kind of false idea about who he is and what he's about. He doesn't want them to think that he's that kind of Messiah, whatever that means. He wants them to experience the kingdom of God, primarily. He's trying to teach a radical new idea. And so in the case of the woman with the hemorrhage, instead of making a secret of it, he blows it up. The woman with the hemorrhage is trying to keep it secret. She's sneaking in through the crowd and reaching out, and notice all she's doing is touching the hem of his robe. She's not touching his arm, his head, his hands, or anything. She's just touching the hem of his robe. And then she's like, get out of here quick before somebody catches me stealing health. And Jesus catches her. He could have let it pass, but somehow he senses something has happened, and he looks around and says, okay, who did that? And she has to come forward. And it says in fear and trembling. Because she's used to being treated pretty badly. And she knows she's committed a grave offense. And she's expecting to be chastised and humiliated, which is kind of standard. And he doesn't do that. But he stops this whole procession. Now remember, they're in a hurry. They're trying to get, this is before Jairus' daughter is healed, right? They're trying to get there before she dies. But Jesus stops the whole party and creates this whole show, this big conversation with this poor woman who really just tried to fade into the background now. And he says to her something very interesting. He says, your faith has made you well. What does he mean by that? In the case of Jairus' daughter, he just goes in and raises her up. He doesn't talk about anybody else's faith. But in this story, he says to her, your faith has made you well. He wants everybody to hear that. He wants everybody to know that because he is proclaiming, I think, because he is proclaiming the kingdom of God. He's saying he wants everyone to see that God's care is for every human being, regardless of their status, regardless of society's opinion about them. And that this woman knew that. She knew that. She was participating in the kingdom of God from the moment she made up her mind to weasel her way through that crowd and touch his robe. She knew that God's love and healing power was for her. And she demonstrated that by her courage, acting against all of the prohibitions of her time, to go and claim what she believed God wanted her to experience. And Jesus makes her an example. She has been an example of shame and humiliation for 12 years. Now he makes her an example of faith and courage. And he holds her before everyone and says, my daughter, my daughter, my daughter. What a sweet thing to say. You are mine. You belong to me. We're family. And you have claimed the healing God gave you. Your faith has made you well. This faith is the faith that we try to hold together as a community. The faith that makes people well. We try to proclaim that God is the healer. We're not in charge of that. But we can create a community. We can create a kingdom environment in which people understand that every human being is a beloved child of God. That no one should endure suffering needlessly. Makes me think about domestic violence. It really does. You know, it seems to be a cohort, a connection with this story. You know, in our day, that shame and the fear and the financial constraints that go along with abusive situations, the isolation. One wonders, you know, it isn't any mystery to me why people in domestic violence situations stay. It really isn't. There are so many obstacles to leaving. What is a mystery to me is how people find the grace to transcend those situations. How they find the hope in a situation where you are living with chronically debilitating low self-esteem, you know, having the self-esteem battered out of you. How do you begin to believe that you are somebody and get the emotional energy that it requires to make a completely new start and to do so in a way that preserves your life while you're doing it? It takes a huge amount of energy to do that. It takes a huge amount of faith. Faith. That faith that one is a child of God and deserves to live a life of wholeness and safety. I was reading some stories of domestic violence survivors and the sorts of things that allowed them to transcend, and it included just getting good information and having access to good information, knowing there's a place to go, knowing there are numbers to call. It had to do with people caring about them enough to notice their situation and say, this is not for you. It had to do with faith communities that didn't say, you really ought to stay and work it out, and forgiveness is God's will for you. But faith communities that said, get safe. We love you. We want you to thrive. And it had to do sometimes with years of listening and support and non-judgment from other caring people. Those were some of the things, along with things just getting so horrible that you just, had to face it one day. And some people had experiences of realizing the impacts on their children. There were many things. But healing, especially when we're talking about anything that is shameful in our society, and domestic violence isn't the only one that is loaded with shame. There's also, addiction. There's also depression. And all kinds of mental illness. It's hard for us to get help and find hope if we don't have somebody telling us that we deserve that. That God's love is larger than our circumstances. So it is my prayer that this community practices those behaviors that give people the freedom to seek healing, that give people the faith to demand what they need and find their way out of horrible situations. We can do that in a number of ways, and one of them is, I think the hardest one actually, is to figure out how to not be so darn perfect. You all look great, you really do. You're beautiful. And we come to church and we like to look great, we like to look nice and we like to be happy and put those smiles on our faces. But it's important for us all to witness to one another to the healing grace of God. And if we've struggled with depression or addiction, to find ways to talk about that. I don't mean that we should be, weeping and carrying on all the time. I just mean that we need to leak out that humanness to one another so that everybody knows that it's safe to be who we are, to be on a journey of transformation, to know that we are not among perfect people as beautiful as we look, but we're among real people who have, at some point in our lives, touched that hem of that robe. When we tell our stories, we give one another courage and hope. I think we need to be a congregation that witnesses to the resources, that knows the resources, that makes the resources part of, puts them on the bulletin board. I love the way, I don't know how many of you go to the ESS breakfast every year, but, we don't just have one table. There's one table of Skip Dunlap gets a bunch of people that are mostly from St. Stephen's, but then there's about 14 other tables with St. Stephen's people sitting at them. And it's wonderful. To know the resources, to be aware and to be out there so that we can offer people support, so that we can give them when it's needed, give one another whenever it's needed, the courage to touch the hem and the faith to be made well. Amen.